connect with one another, whether we're feeling or whether that lens has been put over our eyes and we're seeing the world in a different way. Because we're all experiencing grief in some way. That's what I learned was like, oh
Mm-hmm.
man, we are experiencing grief all the time and we just don't want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we don't have space to. I mean, we've constructed a world that really does struggle to like actually mean the question, how are you? We
Right.
don't, it's like, oh, we don't have time for you to say anything other than I'm fine or I'm okay.
Right. Yeah.
And mostly we're not.
So, it's just an opportunity, I think, for us just to invite all the different ways that people grieve and we grieve. And you and I have talked about that as we've been talking about episode topics of like, no one's grief. There are some parts of it that we share, I think, that like, that sinking feeling, that disbelief, that sort of like desire and longing for it, just like, please let this be not what's happening in my life right now. And yet then there are other things that just, are so different, and just allowing people to grieve in the way that like serves them and moves them, keeps them moving.
Totally. And that feels like an important piece to like underline, highlight, put in bold, like that there's something also really important and to share about both of our hearts around the experience of grief. And I think that's come up in so many of our conversations. It's like, it's so individual and it's so unique. So while you in your grief thought, okay, I'm going to reach out to the people I know who've experienced loss, and you like reached out to me, and it's like my loss was different, even though it was also my father, it was so different in the experience of it. And so for me not to say, oh, I know what you're going through. Like, I don't know what you're going through. And I know it's like, I know this is grief. I mean, even
it's like, then when people are on the other side, are in the grief, those of us who have built that wall or haven't crossed the bridge have no idea what to do. And it's all this fear. I'm afraid I'm going to make you feel worse. I'm afraid you're going to make me feel worse. Right. I'm afraid
it's contagious. Yes.
I'm gonna
right. Well, and
I'm
like,
gonna catch my death.
Right. As you're sharing it, I also feel aware that most likely the people who are choosing to listen to us have experienced grief. And it's really hard to get people who haven't to be willing to have the conversation about grief.
But I would get these, I don't know what's the opposite of an endorphin rush, where I would just fucking cry, and I would be on my bike just like bawling, and it could be a song, or all of a sudden emotion I could just feel it like rising in my body, and it would just come out. And I started to look forward to that part of my workout. Like, I was like, oh, if I need to process some shit, it's going to come out on my bike. This is going to be great. Because I did feel good after. Like, even though I was really sad, there would be this moment where I would just laugh and think, thank God I do this in my basement, because I am like standing up on a stationary bike, sweating and like bawling my eyes out. And so I would have those just gates open. And I noticed that those happened when I had started to try to rein myself in for other people's comfort.
Well, first of all, I love that you initially did not give a fuck about other people's comfort. Amen, amen, amen. Like, and so it feels like such a gift as a woman in our culture that you could do that, right? Because I think emotionality is more present for women, and we're meant to be expressive and feel, like all of the beauty of just like the hormonal pieces and our lives that say feel, feel, feel. We have this directive to feel, and then we have a culture saying don't feel, don't feel, don't feel. And so there's this suppression that happens, and we worry and like, am I doing it right? So I love that you were like, I'm doing it right because I'm fucking sad and I'm crying, right? But then that there's this timeline that starts to happen, and then that voice eventually starts to have power, which I still think it shouldn't. And I actually am like, I've actually said in a group before where someone was like, and you can't cry in a board meeting. And I'm like, I actually want to live in a world where you can cry at a board meeting. Like, that's who I am. So but that I think like the movement piece is so important, and that there's this whole way that, it's stored in our cells. And so it makes sense to me that starting to move in a way that makes you sweat, like it starts to move emotion. And because you were willing and saying yes to this is what's here, you could have that huge release and that feeling of feeling so good on the other side of it. I mean, it's been like 5 years. I should be, and then the shoulds come in and the whatever. And I say, of course you're still sad. What do you mean you shouldn't be sad anymore? Right? Of course you're still sad. It's fucking heartbreaking, and it's never going to stop being heartbreaking. Right?
Yeah.
And we just need to hear that. You don't need to do anything special. The heart just needs to feel witnessed, It's like, just tell me it makes sense. You can say, I hate seeing you suffer, and of course you're suffering. It's so sad. Yeah.
I do remember, that reminds me, one of my uncles hugged me at, I don't remember when, early on. And he just hugged me and he said, this will never be okay. And I was like, and it felt so good because I was like, you're right. Like nothing, no time, no explanation, nothing. This will never be okay. Like it.
Yeah, acute grief is typically the period directly following a loss when the grief is the most intense, because it sort of feels often coupled with trauma, shock, if it was a sudden loss. But it's really, even with people who may have sat by someone's bedside and who was in hospice for a long period of time, and they think, okay, I'm ready, and I understand this is what's happening. There's a difference in the way the world feels when a person is gone. And there's really not a way to prepare for that. So there's always that experience of the intensity of that difference and the intensity of how life starts to feel. And it's kind of it's a constant for a while. It's something that's just like, I'm eating breakfast and that doesn't feel normal anymore. I'm, walking outside to get the mail and that doesn't feel, it's like everything is colored by that feeling of grief. And I would say, like, to give, because a lot of times when you say acute grief, I think people who want to see you doing better will often hope that there's some like, okay, yeah, for a couple weeks or something, right?
Yeah.
It's actually, I always say, like, it can really be intense for the first year, because you're,
our sort of need to want to categorize things and have a plan for things, right? Like we want to plan for our grief. Like, I'm overwhelmed, so when is this part over? And so, that idea of acute, that it is short, that it's like, and everybody else's idea of short is so different, right? Like it's like, and there's no equation, it's not like, oh, he was 70, so my acute grief should be 1/10 of that. There's no equation. Like a mother who loses her child, how long that acute grief will last, and everything can seem fine. And then suddenly you're just overwhelmed. Like I'd be brushing my teeth, some, seemingly inane activity, and suddenly there I would just be in tears. So I think that unpredictability and giving yourself the grace to like weather those moments and be open to them, is it's just like the most generous thing you can do for yourself at that time, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what's really challenging, and this was something I've just been thinking about a lot this week too, is when you are the person in the acute grief, there's nothing that you can do when you're in those overwhelming moments. There's nothing to do or say, or like, you can try to find your way towards a distraction, but you just don't know what that distraction might also bring up. If you're, it almost is like nowhere feels safe.
We recoil from the notion that this is it, that this life, with all its flaws and inescapable vulnerabilities, its extreme brevity, and our limited influence over how it unfolds, is the only one we'll get a shot at. And so I read that and I was like, to embrace that, to embrace its brevity, to embrace, which the brevity part isn't the hard part for me. The part that's hard is like the limited control. That's my piece to wrestle with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, when I left my job and have sort of turned on the person that I was building for 35 years, just decided I'm gonna be somebody different. I think I've had to embrace like that idea of like flow and unpredictability, and getting more used to it. So I just, it's a beautiful book, and maybe it will terrify you, and maybe it will, bring you some light bulb moments, and I don't know, but I would recommend giving it a shot for sure. So thank you for it. I love it.
You're welcome. Yeah. And I mean, I'm glad that you actually enjoyed it, because I do feel a little bad for the people who were like, wow, that was dark. And I'm like, it wasn't dark, but we all get to have different experiences. Totally. I just wasn't expecting that. But one of for me, like the chapter that I really love in the book is that there's a chapter called Cosmic Insignificance Therapy.
Oh my gosh.
Just to really kind of also recognize you don't have to do anything really significant in your life, and that your life is significant and meaningful because of what you've chosen to do in this moment, right? And that we each, like, your world is your world, and that there's something really significant in the impact that you have there. So it was like this blend of, when I was reading it, I was thinking, well, that could be really depressing. Like, oh, it won't matter. And he's like, even the things that we think are significant that we can track, like, oh, Steve Jobs made the iPhone. Like, there's a point where that's not going to be significant to anyone, or like Earth's just not going to exist anymore. Like, we can't be significant forever. Everything falls away. And so it's just like really recognizing you matter to someone, your life matters here, and you don't have to do anything amazing with it. And